The rubber band background technique creates a fun, whimsical backdrop, but those fun squiggly lines can be transformed into an elegant background when done with metallic embossing powder and distress ink. Let me show you the tools and products you're going to need to do this technique. First, you're going to need some embossing powder, and I am using the Ranger Superfine Detail Gold. Then you're going to need an anti-static pad and some cardstock, and I'm using the Gina Designs Pure Luxury 120-pound white cardstock. You're also going to need some ink pads, and I'm using the Tim Holtz Distress inks in Crushed Olive, Rusty Hinge, Barn Door, and Walnut Stain. You're also going to need a Versamark pad and some sort of sponge or sponge applicator to apply the ink. Now you can either use a sponge dauber, or for this technique I really like to use the Ink Essentials foam applicators. Then you're going to need a brayer. And what I've done here is I've taken the rubber barrel out and I've replaced it with an acrylic barrel. And then I've wrapped skinny rubber bands around the acrylic barrel and then popped it into place. Now you can try this technique with thicker rubber bands too for a whole different look, but the thin ones are nice for just those thin, elegant lines. To begin, I'm going to use the anti-static pad to remove any oil on the surface of the cardstock and to remove the static so that my embossing powder only sticks to the Versamark ink and not to anything else on the cardstock. Then, using my brayer, I'm going to ink it up using some Versamark ink. Now when you ink up a brayer, make sure you don't use a back and forth motion like this. If you do that, you're actually only going to ink up half of the rubber bands. You want to actually roll and lift, roll and lift, roll and lift, and continue to do that in one direction to make sure that the entire barrel rotates completely and your rubber bands get completely covered with Versamark ink. And now very lightly, I'm going to just run up the cardstock like that. And I know it's hard to see on the screen, but you can actually see the watermark that this Versamark ink leaves behind. And I'll do one more and maybe one more. Okay. So now I've added some squiggly lines using the Versamark pad and the brayer. And now I'm going to sprinkle embossing powder over that entire thing. And as you can see, I'm using a little piece of folded cardstock. It kind of contains the embossing powder and makes it easier to get it back into the jar later. Okay. And then once you've tapped off all the embossing powder except what's stuck to the Versamark pad, just blow away any excess. This way any little tiny flecks that got stuck on there won't leave a little embossed mark. Okay, and now using my heat tool, I'm going to emboss those lines. Okay, now that we've got our lines going in this direction embossed, now we're going to create lines going in the opposite direction using, again, the Versamark pad and the brayer and then some embossing powder. Now just give that piece of cardstock just a minute to cool down, because if the embossing powder is still really hot, it can also be a little bit wet and then you could smear it. Now once you know it's all cool, you can rub that anti-static pad over it one more time, because I may have gotten some oil from my fingers on there or just kind of created a staticky environment. And again, inking up the entire barrel of the brayer, hitting the rubber bands. I'm going to come down like that and do it again. Now when you're actually using the brayer, don't press down too hard, because you actually don't want the barrel to touch the cardstock. You just want the rubber bands to touch the cardstock, or else you'll just get a big smear of Versamark. And now, because this piece of cardstock is longer going this way, my next two rolls I'm going to go upward to make sure I have darker lines down here as well. And my last one. Okay, and now my final gold embossing powder on these lines. Now when you see this like this, you probably think, wow, this looks really crazy. I don't know how that's going to look soft and elegant, but wait till you see what happens when you hit it with the ink. Okay. Okay. And there's our finished embossed background. Now for the next step, we're going to add some of these beautiful distress inks. And I'm going to start with the Rusty Hinge, which is really one of my lighter colors. And I'm going to ink up my foam applicator. And then using a circular motion, I'm going to add color on top of this embossed lines. And you can already see how subtle these are beginning to look. The lines are beginning to look. And I don't want to make it too uniform, so I like the fact that some of it's a little bit darker and some of it's a little bit lighter in spots. For my next color, I'm going to add some of the crushed olive. And I have a different applicator for that. Now you don't need to have a separate applicator for every color. It does make it easier if you're doing a video, but you can also just peel off this foam and put a different foam on for a different color. So you might want to have 2 or 3 handles so that you don't have to do that all the time, but it's not necessary to have 40 or 50 handles if you have that many ink colors. Okay, now I'm going to add some of that crushed olive, and you can see when it mixes with that Rusty Hinge how it doesn't really look so green, but it just gives it just a nice complementary shade. And you can see I'm just adding it in spots like that, and I still have my gradient look. And now I'm going to add some of the barn door. I'm going to just tap some of that off. And this I'm just going to go a little bit light with, just in a couple little places. And then my final color is going to be the walnut stain. And again, I just want to add a little bit of this walnut stain because I want to kind of make it look a little bit more distressed, a little bit shabbier, and some of those brown tones in there will really create that effect. Okay, and a little bit here and there. See how that just kind of ages it a little bit. And my final step for this background is to take a piece of paper towel, and you want to just rub over the surface of it to remove any ink that might be just resting on top of that embossing powder. Now let me show you my finished card project. And you can see how those beautiful lines just shimmer and shine in the background, but because of those inks being on top, it makes it a little bit more subtle. And what I've done here is I've used 2 of the stamps from the new Scent with Love Stamp TV kit. I stamped the flowers and then colored them with Copic markers and added a couple of the little copper brads in there to kind of play off of the metallic look of the background. I also stamped the You Make My Heart Bloom greeting here at the bottom, and then I've cut them out with nestabilities, and I've just sponged a little bit of ink in there to create a distressed feel on my focal image and greeting as well. Try this technique on different colored cardstock using clear embossing powder and deeper, darker distress inks for a masculine, muted look. Or try some white embossing powder and bright, vibrant inks for a more whimsical look.